Hey guys, sorry that I can't be there to wow you with my charm and my cool demeanor, but I have to do it from home. So, culture during the Reformation period was not as significant as, say, religion, because Reformation was mostly a religious series of changes. So, cultural aspects of the Reformation time period mostly were comprised of literature and literacy and printing, especially. So, literature during this time was becoming a lot more readily available to the common people. The majority of the public were now able to just go to a store and just buy a book for a reasonable price now that they weren't so expensive, because printing was a process that made the production of books a lot easier than it had in the past. In the past, what would have had to done was, and it's almost strictly religious. In the past, had monks would mostly monks would just sit down and just scribe and just copy books day in and day out, as we saw in Name of the Rose. So now that this of course made it very expensive, because a lot of time and manpower went into producing these books. But now that printing had become available, this was not necessary, so the price dropped tremendously. And printing was a key tool in which Martin Luther used to spread his ideas around Germany, especially because throughout the 16th century and the Reformation period, over 1 million copies of Martin Luther's 95 Thesis, as well as other works of his, were produced. Over 1 million, and this is in the 1500s. Well, now that over 1 million had been produced, people, just common people, could read his work, and also Luther's writings were in German as well as in Latin. So now people could read the German, because normally they would go to church, they would hear a sermon in Latin, which they most likely would not understand. And so now that they could read, now they had this literature available to them, they could read it as well, because it was in German, or people could say it out loud, and then others would listen to them. So, because of this, literacy among the common people was rising tremendously. People now, the main source for people before this had been the Bible. This is how they learned how to read and write, but that was mostly in Latin. So now that they had Bibles or now that they had writing in German, they could also learn to read and write from that. So, literacy rate among just the majority of the people was rising now. And also, because of printing, propaganda was also being produced for different causes, for Luther, for the church, for advertising, you name it, they got it. And so comics were being produced, drawings, pictures. These are all tools to spread ideas around. And this really helped Martin Luther spread his ideas around Germany. Architecture, it wasn't so much in the Reformation period. There's actually very few churches built, despite seeing in the movie Luther. The Pope wanted to build that huge, magnificent temple, oh, not temple, but church. But in fact, very few churches were actually built during this time. This was because during the Renaissance, the Renaissance was essentially a cultural time of change, and so a lot of architecture was being changed. But now in the Reformation, they kind of moved on, and nothing really, no really style of architecture had changed too much. So as a result of that, not very many buildings, not very many churches were actually built. Okay, economics. The main fabric of the economy in Reformation period was comprised of what was called mercantilism. This was a country's supply of bullion, or gold, and this meant that now, as opposed to the past, a country had one source of all their wealth, and like in a treasury, and they could measure it, and this was called bullion. And so they sought to increase their supply of this gold, of this bullion, to become more wealthy and more powerful. So this sparked the use of trade throughout Europe. Trade and import and export that skyrocketed, and reached all-time highs, because now countries were more unified and they were trading with one another, and just money was flooding in. And so this gold, or like the wealth that they got from this, was used for everything, for infrastructure especially, throughout some countries to improve trade. So this means like infrastructure is what makes up a society, that makes up the physical society. So nowadays, infrastructure would include hospitals, roads, highways, grocery stores, everything like that. But back then, it would probably have been ports, like seaports, roads, markets, stuff like that. So now this gold is being used to improve this to make trade more fluid. Also, another big change in the economy in the Reformation period was that gold was or money was being lent to businesses, to individual businesses, like it is today. And this has never really been done before that. It more before the Reformation had mostly been like a serf would go to his master and ask to borrow a certain sum of money, and these were more like micro loans. But now money is being lent to big businesses, like clothing companies, sea trade companies, stuff like that. So imports and exports, of course, led to the gold that was being come in. But despite all this importing, exporting, and trade, and bullion, and mercantilism, 80% of the population still relied on agriculture. However, most people were still farming for sustenance to just get enough food to get by. But mostly between like the common people, the people that relied on the agricultural aspects, they used a system called bartering to trade. And an example of bartering would be, I'll give you an oxen if you paint my house, something like that. It was like kind of an exchange. So you give someone something in return for another item, and there wasn't really a monetary system. It's just a item system. So people would do something for another person, and that person would do something for them. So there's not really any money involved, and the only money that the people did have was often given up to the church, because the church and the monarchy alike taxed the common people incredibly. Church tax, just lots of taxes, because the church wanted to increase their supply of bullion, not only by trade but also by taxing their people. A way in which the church got a lot of their money was also indulgences at the time. These were little relics that were potentially saved you from a certain amount of time in like hell. And so, like the movie in Luther, we saw how by climbing the steps of that one church, you could reduce your grandmother's sentence by 10,000 years, something like that. So the church, when they did have this money, sometimes built the grand buildings and churches that we've all seen. But this was mostly later on, because after all, there wasn't too much architecture and building going on throughout the Reformation.